A piercing cry cuts through the blizzard's howl, echoing from a dry well on the frozen Llano Estacado in 1874. Martha Calloway, a widow hardened by grief and a town's bitter whispers, clutches her rifle, haunted by the belief that Comanches killed her husband. Yet, in the snow, she finds 3 starving children and their wounded father, Takani, whose desperate eyes challenge her hatred. What begins as a reluctant act of mercy sparks a fight for justice that will redefine her world. Will Martha's heart thaw before the storm consumes them all? Subscribe now, share where you're listening from, and uncover how courage forges a family from ashes. Don't miss the truth waiting at the end. The wind screamed across the Llano Estacado, a merciless wail that tore at the seams of Martha Calloway's small cabin in the winter of 1874. Snow piled against the warped planks, clawing at the edges like a living thing hungry for warmth. Inside, Martha sat by a fire that flickered weakly as a dying man's breath, her fingers working a needle through an old shirt, stitching memories she couldn't let go. Jacob's shirt. The man the town swore was cut down by Comanches, his blood soaked into the prairie 2 years gone. She didn't cry anymore. Tears froze too quickly out here. But her chest carried a weight heavier than the oak table beside her. A sound broke the wind's howl, faint at first, like a lamb lost in the storm. Martha's hand stilled. It came again, sharper, a cry that wasn't animal, wasn't wind. It clawed up from the dry well near the horse shed, a sound so raw it yanked her to her feet. She grabbed the old Winchester from above the mantel, its wood worn smooth by Jacob's hands, and a lantern that sputtered in the cold. Her boots crunched into the snow, the air biting her lungs like shards of glass. The shed loomed ahead, a shadow hunched against the white dark. The cry grew louder, human, desperate, a child's voice frayed by hunger. She swung the lantern over the well's edge. 3 small shapes huddled below, wrapped in torn burlap sacks, their faces pale as bone under tangled hair. 2 girls, maybe 8, clung to each other, their eyes wide and gleaming like trapped deer. A boy, younger, no more than 4, lay slumped against the stone, his breath a shallow rasp. Martha's heart kicked hard, a jolt she hadn't felt since Jacob's coffin was lowered into the earth. She set the rifle down, her hands moving before her mind could argue, and hauled up a rope from the shed. The girl scrambled up first, thin arms trembling as they gripped the line. The boy was heavier, burning with fever, his small body limp as she pulled him into her arms. Then she saw him. A tall figure stood in the snow, half hidden by the storm's veil, his silhouette sharp against the white. Takani, she'd learn later. But in that moment, he was just a man, broad-shouldered, clad in tattered leather, blood crusted on his shoulder, where a wound had torn through. His eyes held hers, black as coal, proud but broken, like a wolf too tired to run. No coat, no weapon, just open palms, raised to show he meant no harm. Martha's grip tightened on the rifle. "You lost?" she said, voice rough from disuse, sharp as the wind. He didn't answer, just watched her, his breath steaming in the cold. She glanced at the children, the girl's cheeks blistered red, the boy's fever-hot skin against her arm. The town's whispers echoed in her head. Comanches, killers, savages. Jacob's blood on their hands, they'd said. But this man wasn't lunging, wasn't begging. He just stood there, waiting, as if the storm itself would judge him. The boy coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and something in Martha snapped, like a fence post giving way. "Get inside," she said, not to him, but to the children, pointing to the cabin. "Move." They hesitated, eyes flicking to their father. Then the older girl, Nita, took her sister's hand, and they stumbled through the snow, the boy cradled in Martha's arms. She didn't look back at Takani, but left the door open behind her, a crack of light spilling into the dark. An invitation, maybe, or a test. Inside, she set the boy near the hearth, his small chest heaving. The girls clustered close, whispering in a tongue she didn't know, their hands smoothing his hair. Martha fetched a pot of broth, thin but warm, and tore bread into pieces. Nita took the spoon, feeding her siblings, with a care that spoke of too many hungry nights. The door creaked. Takani stepped inside, just past the threshold, smelling of wet leather and frost. He didn't move toward the fire, didn't speak, just stood with his back straight, eyes on his children. Martha tossed a blanket his way. "Take it," she said. "I ain't burying nobody this winter." He nodded once, wrapping the wool around his shoulders, and sat by the door, watchful as a hawk. The boy coughed again, and Martha knelt, her hand on his burning forehead. Pneumonia, maybe. She'd seen it take Jacob too fast to name. She didn't know why she spoke aloud. "He needs help." Takani shifted, pulling a small pouch from his belt. Cedar bark, herbs, something sharp-smelling. She took it, boiled water, and made a tea that eased the boy's breathing. As the fire crackled low, Martha sat back, her eyes meeting Takani's. "Names?" she asked. "Nita, Taya, Kale," he said, voice low, rough like gravel. He nodded at the boy. "Kyle's the youngest." Martha let the names settle, heavy as stones in her chest. She hated Comanches, or thought she did, for what they'd taken. But these were children, and this man wasn't the shadow she'd cursed in her grief. The storm raged outside, sealing them in this fragile truce. She didn't know then that this night would shift her world, that these strangers would carve a place in her heart as sure as a blade on wood. If this story's pulling you in, folks, consider subscribing to keep up with tales like these. Stories of grit and heart from the wild frontier. Share where you're listening from. I'd love to know what corner of the world's hearing this. Stick around to see if Martha's hate holds, or if something stronger takes root in this frozen land. The snow kept falling, and the cabin held its breath, waiting for what came next. The snow kept falling, and the cabin held its breath, waiting for what came next. Dawn broke over the Llano Estacado in 1874, gray and grudging, the light seeping through the cabin's frost-rimmed windows like spilled milk. Martha Calloway stirred the fire, coaxing embers into flame, her hand steady but her mind a churn of thorns. The children slept on a pallet near the hearth, their small bodies tangled in blankets. Nita's arm draped over Taya, Kyle's fevered breathing softer now. Takani sat by the door, still as stone, his eyes fixed on the glow of the fire, the blanket she'd given him folded tight around his wounded shoulder. The air between them was taut, a rope stretched to snapping. Martha moved to the kettle, her boots scuffing the worn floorboards. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But she couldn't ignore the way he'd handed her that pouch of herbs last night, the way his hands, rough as bark, had been gentle when he checked Kyle's fever. She poured water, set it to boil, and glanced at him. His silence wasn't defiance. It was something else, like a man carrying a load too heavy to speak of. She'd hated Comanches for Jacob's death, but this man, this Takani, wasn't the shadow she'd cursed. Still, trust was a currency she'd long spent dry. The morning unfolded in quiet labor. Martha kneaded dough, her fingers sinking into the flour-dusted mass, while Nita stirred awake, her dark eyes tracking Martha's every move. The girl didn't speak, just watched, like a colt sizing up a stranger. Martha tore off a piece of dough, handed it to her. "Shape it," she said, voice low. Nita hesitated, then took it, her small hands mimicking Martha's, clumsy but earnest. Taya woke next, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and joined her sister, their fingers leaving smudges on the table. Kyle coughed, but it was lighter now, and he sat up, clutching the wooden knife Takani had carved. Outside, Takani worked without being asked. The axe bit into logs with a steady thwack, each swing deliberate, the sound echoing like a heartbeat across the snowbound prairie. He didn't come inside, didn't eat until Martha set a plate of flatbread by the shed. She caught him pausing, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold, his breath clouding the air like smoke from a signal fire. He fixed a loose plank on the shed door, his hands moving with a craftsman's care, and when he found a crack in the roof, he climbed up with a bundle of salvaged boards, patching it against the next storm. Martha watched from the porch, her shawl tight against the wind, her rifle leaning nearby, not aimed, but present. By noon, the cabin smelled of baked bread and cedar smoke. The children ate in silence, sharing the loaf evenly, their eyes brighter than the night before. Nita hummed a tune, soft and winding, like a creek over stones. It wasn't English, wasn't anything Martha knew, but it settled in her chest, loosening something she hadn't known was knotted. She caught herself humming back, just for a moment, and stopped, her face warming. Taya giggled, a sound like a bell in the quiet, and even Kyle smiled, his wooden knife tapping the table. Martha's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. She hadn't heard laughter in this cabin since Jacob's voice faded. Takani came in at dusk, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. He carried a bundle of kindling, stacking it neatly by the hearth. "Fixed the fence," he said, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. Martha nodded, stirring a pot of beans. "Good," she said, not looking up. But she noticed his hands, scarred, steady, the kind that built instead of broke. She thought of Jacob, how his hands had been quick to anger, slamming doors when the world didn't bend his way. Takani's were different, careful, like he knew the weight of every move. The evening deepened, the fire casting shadows that danced across the walls. Nita sat close to Martha, her small fingers tracing the hem of Martha's apron, copying the way she folded it. "You teach me?" Nita asked, her English halting but clear. Martha paused, then handed her a spoon. "Stir slow," she said. Nita obeyed, her face serious, as if the task were sacred. Taya watched, her head tilted, while Kale carved invisible shapes in the air with his knife. Takani sat by the door, his eyes softer now, watching his children bloom in this stranger's home. If these moments of grit and quiet courage speak to you, consider subscribing to hear more tales from the frontier's edge. Share where you're joining us from. I'd love to know what winds carried you here. Stick with us to see if this fragile bond holds or shatters under the weight of what's coming. Martha didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire, the children's breathing a steady rhythm, Takani's silhouette still by the door. The town's whispers gnawed at her. Comanches, savages, Jacob's blood. But the man across the room wasn't a killer. He was a father, a survivor, like her. The storm outside had eased, but another was brewing, not in the sky, but in the world beyond the cabin. She felt it in her bones, the way a rancher feels a stampede before it starts. The fire popped, and she gripped her chair, knowing the days ahead would test this uneasy peace. The fire popped, and Martha gripped her chair, knowing the days ahead would test this uneasy peace. The Llano Estacado stretched silent under a sky bruised gray in the winter of 1874, the snow thinning to reveal patches of hard earth, like secrets clawing free. Martha Calloway stood on the porch, her breath clouding in the dawn chill, watching the horizon, where trouble always rode in. Inside, the children's laughter had woven a fragile warmth into the cabin, but the weight of Bitter Creek's whispers pressed heavier now. Takani's presence, his quiet labor, and the children's growing trust had stirred something in her, a flicker of life where grief had long ruled. But trust was a brittle thing, and the truth about Jacob's death still gnawed at her bones. By mid-morning, the air carried a sharp edge, the kind that promised a storm, or worse. Martha was mending a torn saddlebag when hoofbeats thudded in the distance, steady as a war drum. She set the needle down, her pulse quickening, and stepped outside. 3 riders crested the rise, their coats dusted with snow, horses snorting steam. Amos Reddick led them, his grin sharp as a skinning knife, eyes glinting with the kind of malice that thrived in lawless places. His men flanked him, rifles slung low, their faces hard as the frozen ground. Martha's hand rested on the porch rail, close to the Winchester leaning against it. Takani emerged from the shed, axe in hand, his stance calm but coiled, like a rattler before the strike. "Morning, Ms. Calloway," Reddick drawled, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Heard you're keeping strange company. Red savages, no less. Is that true?" His voice was oil slick, but his gaze cut like barbed wire, lingering on Takani. Martha's jaw tightened. "My land, my business," she said, her voice steady as iron. "You got no call riding up here, Reddick." He leaned forward in the saddle, his smile curling. "Your man was stubborn too, Jacob. Look where that got him, bleeding out in the dirt." The words hit like a bullet. Martha's breath caught, her fingers twitching toward the rifle. Jacob, dead 2 years, his body found torn by lead. The town swearing Comanches did it. Reddick's eyes gleamed, savoring her reaction. "He didn't bend, so we broke him," he said, low enough for only her to hear. "You keep this up, you'll break too." Takani stepped forward, axe still, his silence louder than any threat. The riders tensed, hands on their guns, but Reddick raised a palm, laughing. "We'll be back, widow. Land like this doesn't belong with a woman gone mad." They wheeled their horses and rode off, dust mixing with snow. Martha stood rooted, Reddick's words burning through her. Not Comanches, not Takani's people. We broke him. The lie she'd carried, the hate she'd fed, crumbled like ash. She turned to Takani, her voice a blade. "Inside. Now." The children were at the table, Nita teaching Taya to braid rope, Kyle whittling with his wooden knife. Martha shut the door, the cabin dim despite the fire. "Tell me," she said to Takani, her eyes locked on his. "What happened to my husband?" He met her gaze, unflinching, his voice low as a distant storm. "I saw it. 2 winters back. Jacob drove cattle, refused to pay Reddick's men for passage. They ambushed him at dusk. White men, not mine. Reddick shot first. Jacob fell, still gripping his reins. His words were plain, unadorned, but they cut deep, carving away the myth Bitter Creek had built." Martha's knees buckled, but she caught the table's edge, her knuckles white. The town had lied, or they'd believed the lie, to protect thieves like Reddick. Her hate had been a noose, and she'd worn it willingly. If this tale of betrayal and truth hits you where you live, consider subscribing to keep these frontier stories coming. Share where you're listening from. I'd love to know what trails led you here. Stay with us to see if Martha's fight for justice breaks her or builds something new. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she'd buried with Jacob. Instead, she moved to the hearth, staring into the flames as if they held answers. Nita's braiding stopped, her small hands hovering, sensing the shift. Taya whispered something to Carl, who clutched his knife tighter. Takani stood by the door, his scarred hands loose, waiting for her to speak. "They'll come back," Martha said, her voice low, steady. "Not just for you, for this land." Takani nodded, his eyes dark with understanding. "Then we prepare." That night, Martha didn't sleep. She cleaned the Winchester, her fingers tracing the scratches Jacob had left on the stock. The children slept close, their breathing a soft rhythm against the wind's howl. Takani sharpened his axe by the fire, the blade catching the light like a warning. The truth had freed her from one lie, but bound her to a new fight. Reddick's men weren't just thieves, they were murderers, and her land was their prize. The cabin, once a tomb for her grief, now held something fiercer, a resolve to protect what was hers and the people she hadn't meant to claim. The truth had freed her from one lie, but bound her to a new fight. Reddick's men weren't just thieves, they were murderers, and her land was their prize. The cabin, once a tomb for her grief, now held something fiercer, a resolve to protect what was hers and the people she hadn't meant to claim. The Llano Estacado brooded under a sky thick with menace in the winter of 1874, the air heavy with the scent of coming snow. Martha Calloway stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass, her fingers tracing the cold barrel of the Winchester. The truth about Jacob's death burned in her gut, a fire stoked by Reddick's taunting grin. Takani's axe scraped against a whetstone in the corner, the sound steady as a pulse, his eyes sharp with the same resolve. By dusk, the storm rolled in, a howling beast that shook the cabin's walls and buried the prairie in white. Martha checked the traps they'd set, sharpened stakes hidden in snowdrifts, ropes stretched taut across the yard, the dry well rigged with loose boards to trip a horse. Takani had scouted the land, his steps silent despite his wounded shoulder, mapping paths where the wind would blind attackers. The children, Nita, Taya, and Kyle, sat by the hearth, their faces tight with understanding beyond their years. Martha knelt, handing Nita a small knife, its blade glinting in the firelight. "Stay low. Stay sharp," she said, her voice firm but soft. Nita nodded, her jaw set like her father's, while Taya clutched Kyle's hand. The attack came at midnight, heralded by a flare of light through the storm. Flames licked the shed, the crackle of burning wood drowned by the wind's roar. Reddick's men, 5 shadows on horseback, circled the cabin, their shouts cutting through the blizzard. Martha peered through a slit in the shutters, her heart pounding like hooves on hardpan. Reddick's voice rang out, raw with hate. "Come out, widow! You and your savage ain't worth this land!" A torch arced through the air, sizzling as it hit the snow near the porch. Takani stood by the door, axe in one hand, a coil of rope in the other, his eyes locked on Martha. "Now," he said, and she nodded. They moved as one. Martha cracked the door, firing a warning shot that echoed like thunder, the recoil jarring her shoulder. A rider cursed, his horse rearing as it hit a hidden rope, tumoring him into a drift. Takani slipped outside, a shadow in the storm, looping another rope around a post to trip a second horse. The wind carried his movements, hiding them from Reddick's men. Martha reloaded, her hand steady despite the cold seeping through her coat. Inside, the children crouched behind the table, Nita's knife trembling but ready. Kyle's small voice whispered, "We fight?" Martha's throat tightened. "We hold," she said, her eyes never leaving the window. Reddick charged the porch, his rifle raised, his face twisted with fury. Martha aimed, but before she could fire, Nita darted from the shadows, her small body slamming into his legs. He stumbled, his shot going wild, the bullet splintering the doorframe. Nita scrambled back, her knife slashing at his boot, drawing a howl of pain. Martha seized the moment, her Winchester roaring as she fired, the bullet grazing Reddick's arm. He cursed, dropping his torch, which hissed out in the snow. Takani surged forward, axe swinging, not to kill, but to drive them back, his blade catching a rider's gun and sending it spinning into the dark. The storm turned ally, its gusts blinding the attackers, snow clogging their eyes and guns. One man fell into the well's rigged boards, his scream cut short as the wood gave way. Another's horse slipped on a hidden stake, throwing him into the frozen dirt. Reddick, blood dripping from his arm, roared for retreat, his men scrambling to their mounts. Martha fired again, the shot punching through the night, and Reddick's hat flew off, lost to the wind. "This ain't over!" he shouted, but his voice cracked, fear bleeding through. They rode into the blizzard, shadows swallowed by white, leaving the shed smoldering and the cabin scarred, but standing. Martha lowered the rifle, her breath ragged, the cold burning her lungs. Takani returned, snow clinging to his hair, his axe stained with frost, not blood. Nita stood by the door, her knife still in hand, her eyes wide but fierce. Taya and Kyle emerged, unharmed, their small hands reaching for each other. The fire in the shed died under the snow's weight, leaving only smoke and silence. Martha looked at Takani, then at the children, her chest tight with something fiercer than fear. Pride, maybe, or the raw edge of survival. The cabin stood, and so did they, bound by a fight that had carved them into something new. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a spark of defiance burned brighter, ready for whatever came next. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a spark of defiance burned brighter, ready for whatever came next. Dawn crept over the Llano Estacado in the winter of 1874, a thin gold thread stitching the horizon, where snow gave way to earth waking beneath. Martha Calloway stood amid the smoldering ruins of the shed, the air sharp with ash and frost, her hand still tingling from the rifle's recoil. The cabin stood scarred but unbroken, a testament to the fight that had bound her to Takani and his children, Nita, Taya, and Kyle, in a way blood never could. The truth about Jacob's murder had cut deep, but it had forged something new, a resolve as hard as the prairie's frozen ground. Martha knelt by the charred timbers, her fingers sifting through ash, salvaging what could be saved. Takani was already at work, his axe biting into fresh wood, the steady thwack echoing like a promise to rebuild. His wounded shoulder moved stiffly, but he didn't pause, stacking planks with a quiet strength that spoke louder than words. Nita and Taya ran across the yard, their laughter a defiance of the night's terror, chasing each other through snowdrifts now softening under the sun. Kyle trailed them, his wooden knife tucked in his belt, his small face lit with a grin that hadn't been there days before. Martha watched them, her chest tight with an ache that wasn't grief, but something fiercer. Hope, maybe, or the weight of a family she hadn't chosen, but wouldn't trade. By noon, the sky cleared, a rare blue stretching over the prairie like a clean slate. Martha hitched the mule to a sled, hauling supplies from the cabin to the shed skeleton. Takani joined her, his hands deft as he fitted new beams, his silence a comfort rather than a barrier. They worked side by side, passing tools without speaking, their movements synchronized like a dance learned through hardship. Nita brought water, her small hands steady on the bucket, while Taya gathered stray nails, her braids swinging as she darted through the snow. Kyle sat nearby, carving a stick into a rough horse, his tongue caught between his teeth, mimicking Takani's focus. The land, once a graveyard from Martha's past, now hummed with life, its pulse in their shared labor. Bitter Creek hadn't forgotten, though. A rider came at midday, a young courier from town, his face pale as he handed Martha a folded parchment. No words, just a glance at Takani before he spurred his horse away. The note was a summons, curt and cold, from the town council. They wanted her to explain herself, her land, her guests, her defiance. Martha read it by the new shed frame, her jaw tight, then passed it to Takani. He scanned it, his eyes narrowing, but said nothing. "They think they can scare us off," she said, her voice low, like a blade drawn slow. "They're wrong." She rode to town alone the next morning, her best dress, faded blue, mended at the hem, draped over her shoulders. The wooden knife Cale had given her tucked in her pocket like a talisman. The streets of Bitter Creek fell silent as she passed, eyes following her like vultures circling carrion. In the meeting hall, the council sat, their faces dour as old oak, papers stacked like judgments. "You've made a choice, Ms. Calloway," the eldest said, his voice gravelly. "Shelter in a Comanche and his kin ain't just foolish, it's dangerous." Martha stood tall, her hand steady. "I've made a home," she said. "Ain't yours to judge." They pressed her about the land, the children, the unnatural arrangement. She answered plainly, her words sharp as flint. "They're mine as much as this dirt is. You want to take it, you'll have to kill me." The room stilled, the council's eyes flickering with doubt. Takani wasn't there, but she felt his presence in her spine, in the knife's weight in her pocket. She left without a verdict, but the townsfolk parted as she walked out, their silence not kind, but heavy with respect. Back at the ranch, dusk painted the sky in hues of fire and rose. The children ran to her, Nita with a woven grass bracelet, Taya with a drawing scratched on bark. 5 figures, hand in hand. Kyle tackled her legs, his laughter bright as a bell. Takani stood by the new shed, its frame rising like a vow. Martha met his eyes, and something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but a shared strength, a bond forged in fire and defiance. The cabin glowed with lamplight, the air thick with the smell of beans and wood smoke. Inside, they ate together, the children's chatter filling the silence Jacob's death had left. Martha touched the bracelet Nita had made, her fingers lingering on the woven strands. The land outside bloomed with early green, wildflowers pushing through scars of ash and snow. The cabin, once a cage for her grief, was now a hearth, alive with voices, with breath, with a family carved from courage and choice. The Llano Estacado's winds have quieted, but Martha's story of grit, truth, and a family forged in defiance lingers like wood smoke on the prairie. What did this tale stir in you? Did Martha's courage or Takani's quiet strength hit closest to home? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what this frontier journey meant to you. My gratitude goes to each of you for riding along through this wild, snowy tale. Until we meet again on the next trail, keep your fire burning bright and your heart open to the unexpected. Stay tuned for more stories where the land tests the soul and hope rises from the ashes.